Give us a sync. Cool. All right. So how do we want to start this one?
Yeah, we had a list of things to go over, and what we agreed on loosely, I would say. There's no. I think we don't have any expectation to have a very well bounded kind of conversation, right? But it is to talk about how to think critically about, in general, information, but more specific, how to navigate the landscape of information that we have.
Yeah, exactly.
Nowadays. So
a lot of things we've been talking about lately are monitoring the news, how to monitor the news, what it means to monitor news, and then also what news means in general.
Yes.
And I guess that takes us to a couple of different places, from sort of a more philosophical perspective, from epistemics to really, what information is, how we can look at information and what evidence is, and then also to its direct practical applications in today, where we have multiple different media spheres, they're competing for our attention. And we have also, aside from different outlets of media, we also have different influencers, people who've made a living out of influencing based on their opinion, or also what they're paid to say their opinion is. And the difficulties of navigating all of that and actually coming out with something that reflects the state of things on the ground in different places.
Yeah, I think keeping it within what we talked before on the same room here, we could look at it in different levels as well. So receiving information can happen on the level of your neighbor telling you something, to the mass media, and there's many different degrees between. So we can be talking about all of those different levels on which the transference of information happens, and we can be looking at what is because what I was going to say is actually we had kind of like set our agenda as talking about, well, we didn't set an agenda. We talked about what was actually our purpose, our individual and personal purpose on conducting science and doing research, which is actually dealing with problems that matter. So if we're talking about the low level of receiving information, filtering information, we can talk about the very specifics, the cognitive foundations of it, and the philosophical definitions that you already laid down that we have to talk about in order to clarify what actually that we're talking about. But talking about what matters, we have to look at how receiving information, in this case in mass media, affects the world that we live in.
Yeah. Why don't you start us out there, and then we can sort of break it down to more fundamentals as it becomes necessary.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I think that's within this aspect of how media, how the transference of information, how information is presented, how information is consumed, there's a lot to be talked about. I think it's very hard to narrow down to what actually is the hierarchical structure of what matters on this spectrum. We can talk about different stuff. We can go directly to things like Chomsky and the manufacturing of consent, which I think it became already a little bit outdated. Like things really have been happening really fast. So I think even looking at Chomsky's ideas back there, I think that they can even provide me with the perfect blueprint to what to talk about. So I don't remember it very well, but we're talking about ownership of means of production of information. So And we are talking about within this kind of like Chomsky idea on how the media as this social the social phenomena has in itself the whole the structures that enable us to consent to things that we would not consent if we think critically about them. So the mechanisms are already in place. One of them is the ownership of media. So just big companies owning the ability to put out there information for a very, very large amount of people. I think that's very hard to translate to nowadays. Speed, capillarity, and range of how information is transferred. Ownership, I think it's not the biggest of the issues at the moment. I would say I'm not so sure. Obviously, it does influences, but we're talking about one anonymous viral video becoming widespread and convincing a lot of people. There are other things that we can talk about, but if you wanted to comment anything about ownership of the means of transferring or providing information to people, I think it still play a role. I think that's really important to be talked about. I don't know if it is on the top of the hierarchical thematic of the issues that we see on the world today, but you can tell me what you think.
So ownership is an interesting thing because it's not just the ownership of the content production, but then it's also ownership of the content curation. So what you end up having is a mix of things. You have potentially consolidation of the actual outlets of information, say News Corp. You have Rupert Murdoch curating a lot of the information. A lot of the money that's being distributed is owned by centralized groups of individuals. But then you also have high degrees of consolidation of ownership in terms of the contents, like the actual, the platforms that the content is distributed on. Mm-hmm. So a platform or a company like Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, although WhatsApp is probably to a slightly lesser degree important in this case. But when you have Facebook and Instagram, you have the ways in which information is curated. You have also the ability for somebody to be on a platform or not. So you have exclusion criteria that they might implement. And then you also have the algorithms that are in place, the decision criteria for actually displaying information for people. So I think in that sense, ownership ends up playing a big role because what we have is the production and also the distribution being highly consolidated, and they're slightly different. And so I think in the past, when you had something like while television was also, we sort of moved towards greater consolidation in terms of distribution, mm-hmm. from newspapers to television to digital, and I think that poses a whole set of problems. But maybe one of the things in a meta sense is that it's important to discuss both the problems with the system, which we're doing right now, which are things like ownership and among other things, basically a lot of things that Chomsky does discuss in manufacturing of consent. He discusses more of the systemic problems, mm-hmm. right? But then we also have sort of the cognitive aspect of what does it mean to actually step back and consider these things? What does it mean to equip yourself with the understanding of how these systems manipulate you, mm-hmm. And how they play on our attention, and then also just having this shift to a more critical lens, mm-hmm. on the media itself and just information that we consume. And of course that can go very far in that I guess the ultimate endpoint of a critical perspective is something very solipsistic. It's self-indulgent almost. So how do we find the right balance from believing everything we hear to thinking that we are the ultimate generators of reality. Somewhere in between the gullibility and the solipsism is a balance that we want to achieve, which is something like reflecting the real world. And this sort of signal-noise ratio is ever present in literally everything we do. There are degrees of extremes where we need to find the middle, where we're like, okay, these things are noise, but these are things that I have to take for granted. Otherwise, I'm just going to exist in a place which is fundamentally removed from the rest of reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think but you nailed it. Ownership still play a big role in regard to not only on the production but on the creating of the information and the enabling of spaces which are actually very structured. So you should take like Twitter back there. It has this amount of characters, so that's putting it's putting something into the mix that influence in a different way how people think about the information they are receiving within these platforms, for sure.
And an interesting sidebar is that Twitter, Elon Musk decided recently to hold a vote by the users of Twitter of whether or not to allow Alex Jones, a prominent American conspiracy theorist, right-wing pundit, back onto the platform. And users voted to allow him back on. And this is a purveyor of dangerous content. Elon Musk has also demonstrated himself to be a purveyor of dangerous content. But this is an interesting thing where when trying to understand how to feel about this decision, something where an increasingly right-wing founder of a popular social media outlet allowing a established right-wing mouthpiece back onto a very public platform democratically, when it's democratically allowed to happen and not sort of this top-down power move, it's a very interesting thing, right? Because I disagree with the decision, and the process has a bunch of flaws because it has become increasingly right-wing anyway, so maybe it's a self-solving problem. But when we say something like the ownership is a problem because it consolidates too much power, when somebody makes a democratic, allows it to be a democratic process, and it still has a problematic output, then we, of course, have all these different problems that we have to reconcile, opinions that we have to reconcile all at once, where it's like, yeah, I'd rather this be democratic rather than consolidated. The democratic thing has an outcome that I don't like. What do we do there?
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah. Well, for this specific case, I believe that the followership of Elon Musk, it's definitely obsessed with the same kind of topic that the whole some part of the right-wing troop is obsessed with, which is free speech.
Right.
Well, so I believe that when Musk put it out there, he believed that this mindset would prevail on the voting.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of it was rigged in that sense, in that it was appealing to something that they already wanted. And the great irony, of course, is that he's promoting himself as a free speech advocate, but then, and this is just important in general in terms of critical lenses, is that he's somebody that has tried actively to silence dissenters. There are multiple cases of this. I think that probably the most famous is when somebody had posted a Twitter feed that revealed the movements of his private jet, and because he's talking about sustainability, not using renewable energy sources, the renewable nature of the rockets and the rocket fuel of things like the Raptor engine, but then you have him flying and making really sort of being really unscrupulous in his use of his private jet, and so he paid to get that guy to shut down his account. And then he tried to petition Twitter to get that guy to shut down his account on like personal privacy rights of his whereabouts. But then when he took down Twitter, then when he took over Twitter, he took down that page. And so there's a lot around his this fake appeal to free speech, which is, it's never even somebody who presents themselves as an absolutist is never really an absolutist.
No, absolutely not. What they mean with free speech is just that there is these things that we wanted to say, and you say that we cannot say that. That's basically what they mean. They do not mean in any way a kind of a universal social agreement that everything that can be said should be said. They have absolutely, I think they don't even have considered this fully. So in the case of privacy, for example, those are the same people that probably would say that Julian Assange is a terrorist, or that Chelsea Menace should be put in jail and it's a traitor, or Snowden. They probably, a lot of these people would definitely, I don't know if everyone, but a lot of them would be very divided, at least.
There would at least be division, yeah.
On this issue.
And I think this is where the right wing and the libertarians, sort of the right libertarians, sort of have disagreements, where the libertarians tend to be absolutists on things like this, but the right wing tend to have parameters that they set on what they actually want to hear.
Yeah, that's what I said, that I would bet on the divides, because I have heard also both ways. There is the completely libertarians, and we had in Brazil some cases of people. Well, actually, we had a lot in Brazil, a lot of discussion on that direction, especially interesting. And I think that's a very interesting topic. We're diverging a little bit into free speech, but I think that's fine. Is that how that became a thing into the... Well, it has always been, I believe, in the word, but how that became a topic very present within popular discourse in Brazil, the relationship between comedy and free speech. So I think that has always been there. But most recently, I think most likely, from my perception, is that it began with the increasing on criticizing on the left-wing government on the beginning of the century now, after 2000s, and criticizing on Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party in Brazil, which was they were constantly criticized by the media. So there was no lack of criticizing on the government. The left criticized, including me, criticized the government all the time, and we protest for the mistakes that the center right, center left party for what they were doing. But the comedians, they had this idea that they could not talk about the government, and I do not know exactly where that idea came from. They wanted just to increase the criticizing on the government, but also that kind of like hijacked on this anti-political correct sentiment. So they wanted to make jokes with everything, and they wanted to be allowed to make jokes with everything. That became kind of like a movement in Brazil. That's all of these comedians, they were kind of like gathered together. It's really hard to have a left-wing comedian, like someone that would openly talk about that, like would openly identify themselves as being a left person. And it definitely they are, but they wouldn't say, actually. And the ones that were not, they would openly make it kind of like explicitly that they were right-wing leaning. Because, yes, if I am against the political correct, I'm actually against a type of people. And this type of people are left people. So I have to make jokes about feminism. I have to make jokes. I am allowed to make jokes about blacks. I am allowed to do all those things. So that's what free speech is. But obviously, they're just like surfing on the hype that it would give them. So as much outrageous things they would say, most evident they would become in the media. And that's why a lot of them build their careers on being anti-political correct. That's the best way that they could find the spotlight, right? I think that might play also with some things that we can talk about the media today. So the idea that what is outrageous just gets the spotlight.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing there. You have a group of people who are looking for something like a catharsis because they feel like they are being repressed by the things that they cannot say. But the things that that typically those types of folks feel like they cannot say are the things that are used as tools of oppression for other people. And so there's this funny sort of system. And you kind of have a similar thing in American comedy. You have a similar situation where you have a center-left government, very slightly left of center at this point, maybe just left in some social rhetoric, but fully centrist and sometimes even sort of right-wing in a lot of their military practices. But a lot of comedians, because a lot of them tend to be, there's a good amount that tend to be left-leaning, don't want to criticize the government because they feel like it opens up their party's weaknesses when there's a point where it's so divided. So not a lot of people are actually doing that criticism because they're afraid that their jokes could then be taken out of context and utilized by the opposing party. So if I'm a left-leaning comedian and I make jokes about the left, the right could easily take that and then circulate it. And then all of a sudden on the internet, I'm a right-wing comedian, but actually I'm a left-wing comedian. Mm-hmm. So there's an interesting thing. And then there was the same trend of some comedians pulling themselves more towards the right because there's backlash that they're facing from the things that they've said. Mm-hmm. And I think, we're podcasting, and probably the most salient example is somebody like Joe Rogan, who's never left to begin with, but has been increasingly moving towards the right in leaps and bounds, because there's this, and this is sort of as a cognitive scientist, like there's a clear sort of identity triggering that's happening here, where he's being attacked, he's getting defensive, and then he's shifting his ideas towards the people who are embracing him in that sense. And he's moving literally further right, and he's being pulled with every critique. He's moving further towards the right. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thing, is that when people feel like they are no longer part of a particular group they thought they were a part of, either they cave, like either we would have seen a set of apologies from Joe Rogan, I don't know, 6 years, whatever it was, however many years ago, he started this sort of more precipitous shift towards the right, now that he was ever left. But either he would have apologized and then shifted, or he would have dug his heels in and moved further right. Mm-hmm. And there's this interesting inflection point. And I think maybe that's what we try to do when we put on sort of like a public trials of opinion of individuals. Mm-hmm. We see whether they're going to apologize, cave, and change, or if they're going to dig their heels in and shift further in that direction. And you probably got this interesting thing with the comedians in Brazil.
Definitely. It's very similar. I think that happened with some people for sure. You see the shift, and when there are reactions, you create. Like what usually happens is that you create this persona called cancel culture, and this persona can be blamed by everything.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it's funny how many times I've gotten into this conversation of people telling me, otherwise, I'd say usually it's with people who are in the center or center left, where they're like, yeah, but I just have a problem with cancel culture and people being canceled. And I'm like, what? And what does canceled even mean? Yeah. Right. And it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't.
And the funny thing is how well that idea has been sold to people on the center and the right, where they think that cancel culture is a real thing. And they think that these public trials are not just shows so that people can pick a lane and choose who to follow. Nobody's ever really canceled. Yeah. There are certain cases where, actually highly relevant today, where you get more concrete example, you have 3 presidents of universities, major universities
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, all women, all vocally calling for a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
They worded in different ways. Rather, because I don't have the exact transcripts in front of me, I will say expressed both condemnation of violence in the Middle East by Hamas, but then also expressed concern for Palestinians in the loosest sense, broadest sense, and they came under fire. And two of them were forced to resign, and then one of them, I think Dr. Gay at Harvard, was the one who was allowed by Harvard to keep her position. But here you had this thing where people vocalized a moral concern, a legitimate moral concern, generated by the American government itself. And that the institutions they are part of, leading American institutions, forced these individuals to step down from their positions. And so in that sense, they're not being canceled. And I think that canceling idea doesn't have any weight to it whatsoever. But we do see this this impacting, targeting of individuals to try to ruin their positions, their lives, their careers, etc.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I think that applies to a lot of folks on the right spectrum. On like I have a like I think actually I keep it that what happened to the three women, the three directors, right? Is the interests of the institution being prevailed. So same thing happened to other right-wing folks. Like there is this podcaster in Brazil as well, who were excluded. Like, he said that Brazil should have, or people who had Nazi opinions should be able to express them, or we should like something like that. I'm not going to paraphrase. And he got obviously he got a backlash publicly, and YouTube also demonetized his channel, and you know, we can have the debate of like of Nazi opinions, but I think that's not like, we don't have to get to this point. The point is just that YouTube doesn't want that, you know. The other universities, they don't want that. We can talk about like the in this person in Brazil, you should have noticed that like that's your work. You're representing, you're taking the front lead of an institution, and this institution has interests, and that's what pays your bills. Like if you go against the interests of the institution you're representing, there's a trade-off there. Like you can, and you should express your opinions. Obviously, if your opinion would be harmful or directly incentivize the harm of someone else, you should not express this opinion. But there is a trade-off there, that you're playing or function within this structure. I'm not saying the structure it's fair. I'm saying that we should not look at the middleman. So what happened is not that, well, that was people react to that, and that was the cause of the thing that happened to the life of this person. I think the problem is the relationship between the institutions who have their own interests and the people who have their own opinions. And I think I keep kind of it looks for me, from my perspective, that's what happens most of the time.
I guess the problem is that goes back to this idea of ownership again, where you have large consolidations of power, whether they're in the industry of education or something like content platforms. And you have, I think, greater and greater needs for not that governments are the ideal way to do this, but potentially like non-governmental organizations that create platforms that are used as public messaging boards, like Twitter, like YouTube, where it seems almost it may be, hopefully, in 100 years or a couple of 100 years, it might seem unthinkable to allow a private corporation to own a platform as central to everyone's lives as YouTube or Twitter, where it should be in the public domain, it should be a public good. It seems in any city square, if you go back 300 years, if a private businessman owned the only community message board where you could actually put messages, that would be ridiculous. And maybe that existed in places I don't actually know well enough, but it's a ludicrous idea. But that's the state of things now. And what we have is that generally both anybody outside of the scope of the center is the one suffering from this. And so here you have these, odd bedfellows where I think folks on the right and farther right and folks on the left, especially farther left, have very similar goals in just the democratization or maybe the opening up of different platforms.
Yeah. And obviously the people in the center, they are able to manage to deliver a better product in terms of opinion.
And I think that this is where manufacturing consent comes in again, because what the center is defined by, again, the holders of power, the sort of systemic agents which, don't have clean slates in terms of their past and how they accumulated the power to begin with. And those are the ones who are able to manufacture the consent to keep the center to the agendas that they want to keep the center on. Harvard's history of abuses, of perpetuating systemic injustices is large. And how they came to exist, how they continue to exist, is highly problematic in terms of also what they're invested in even. So there it's a problem of not just, because the discussion could be framed as, well, if they're representing the center, it could be that they're just representing the largest group of people and therefore it seems democratic. But in fact, what the center is almost manufactured. Yep. And I think that's the greatest problem.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think I expressed more than once that not taking a stand is taking a stand for the status quo. And I think my whole point is that, well, the way that I see the world, and I think is the way that I see the transfer of information as well, from the cognitive perspective, from a game theoretical perspective, that people are serving self-interests, institutions are serving self-interests. Maybe we can apply Chomsky ideas to that, to the point that we can say, wow, the functionality of this machine is to create products which are sellable. Even the center might not take the stand because it thinks the status quo is good, but it sells better. And when it sells better and it's more profitable, things just go in the same direction. That's the same thing with many other things. My opinion would be the same. The wars happen because someone is profitable, because they're profitable. So someone profits from them, then they happen. If someone keeps profiting from them, they keep happening. Same thing with media. The flow of information from one side to the other. The manufacturing of consent is profitable. It might keep a war going on. It might keep some status quo to do not change. And while it is profitable, the machine itself perpetuates itself. The machine perpetuates itself. So, kind of even in a functionalist perspective.
Yeah, I think that, and this is sort of an interesting shift that we've seen. War is a good analogy for these things, because you used to have war because somebody thought they could profit by winning a war against somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so both sides were taking a gamble by engaging in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Or if obviously one is the obvious aggressor, then they're taking the gamble by hoping to win, and the other one's just trying to defend themselves and what have you. But we've shifted to a place where many sides profit from a war. Sometimes it's both direct main aggressors are profiting from the war because there are industries built around profiting of war, regardless of whether the war is won, in quotes, or lost, in quotes. It doesn't matter whether how many lives are won or lost, and sort of the economic gains, the geopolitical gains might net out in a decade or two regardless, but the profits that are harvested from that win are immediate for many parties involved. And I think that's a strange sort of difference, because then the engagement in war is less risky. And I think that's one of the bigger problems. And we see the same...
Especially when it's not you.
Yeah, especially when they're proxy wars, especially when you have nothing to lose and you're just selling guns, which we've seen a lot of countries do, even neutral countries that technically don't engage in war, like Switzerland, manufacturing tools of war. But you can take that same concept and then put it into a lot of the business competition that we see from media narratives, where sort of center-left and center-right media agencies basically rely on one another to exist. When you have something like CNN and Fox News in the United States, they literally rely on one another because they use each other for content, because otherwise everything they say is bullshit. But it's a similar type of thing of this everybody wins type of war as long as the war is happening. It's a similar thing with social media where, yeah, technically they're competing with each other, but as long as we're using social media and that type of feedback loop is generated in us, we'll check many social media apps, regardless of whether or not they're competing. And I think that's the same type of thing, where the warfare of your attention, as long as you're wanting to pay attention to things and getting these rewards, it doesn't matter what you're looking at. You look at everything.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. There is everywhere that you look in society today, there is this dialectic process going on. Most of what we see as different tribes, positions, or whatever, they are feeding on each other to keep alive. Well, I think actually there is like so many different ways that wars can be profitable, and I even like back on the past, like you can just convince two neighbors to get into war while you do nothing, and then you get the spoils afterwards. Today, it's not only selling guns. Like wars change the complete landscape of the markets. Like if there is a war going on in Ukraine, you can sell more grains. So suddenly you're just a producer. You're just a country that exports a lot of rice. But it's interesting for you that the people are dying in another country because increases your profit. So it is everywhere. And as you well said, there is wars going on the media spectrum as well, and they are interested that those wars continue because then they have purpose, right? I think that's interesting, right? Because we're talking about information, and if we take the cognitive perspective of it, very raw, that we get information. Well, obviously, we can get information for confirmation bias, but we can get information for many different cognitive reasons, not only confirmation bias. But it seemed like that information, or like, let's say not information, but like the channel or the source, kind of like that thing serves a purpose. So information has a purpose in itself, its own thing.
Yeah.
It's like it's something, maybe a little bit like the free speech kind of ideas. Like it has the purpose of a revolution, of kind of like a humanity revolution towards a world where, for some reason, it's going to be better because everybody can say whatever they. So there is this intrinsic value on a specific kind of information which is not only in the service of the individual from the cognitive perspective. It's just like, well, I believe that this thing has to be said because of the thing itself, because of the do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, we're touching on exactly what I work on. I guess the thing is that we all hold to various degrees beliefs. The beliefs tend to be prioritized relative to one another. My belief in one thing might be more important to me than my belief in another thing. And so when we're interacting with information, I think there are multiple different ways that we can do that interaction. One is directly with the information itself, where we say, okay, is this congruent with what I already believe? And it can sort of confirm an existing belief exactly as we already believe it, or it can appeal to an existing belief, and therefore we can update or amend our belief in order to accommodate that information. So that's sort of like more of a learning. Mm-hmm. But then when we're engaging with information itself, we have multiple ways to sort of test its validity. And maybe this is also getting at what we had spoken about speaking about, right? Which is that if I engage with content, if it doesn't immediately appeal to a belief, I can't make an immediate assessment on it. So I find information saying the way the economy is being managed is poor. So I can, if that appeals to an existing belief, we're good. But if not, then I can look at the source that said it. And if maybe I already trust that source. So I trust person P, they said that, and I'm like, okay, great. So now the economy is being mismanaged. I will accept my belief. But then if I don't know person P, I can look at the other things they've said, and I can see if I agree with them. Say they agree with things like social welfare and universal healthcare, things like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, well they believe things that I believe, therefore maybe they're a good source of information as an economist. Mm-hmm. So I can look at the other information the sources produce, so like 1 degree removed from the information itself. Then if I don't know that person, then I can go 2 degree removes. I can just look at the other people that agree with that person. Mm-hmm. So I go to person Q, and person Q believes the things I believe, and person Q agrees with person P. So now all of a sudden I go to person P again. And so there's this interesting sort of way that we look for the validity of information, and we do these rapid searches to see what's congruent with what we believe and what's incongruent, and then make those assessments. And I think one of the interesting things is when the belief that a particular source is correct can be more prioritized than the belief that a certain thing is correct. So say I believe that the infectious disease expert in the United States, Anthony Fauci, gives accurate information. And he says something about how the percentage of usefulness that masks have against spreading disease. If my belief that masks are 100% effective is more important to me, more prioritized than the belief that Anthony Fauci is correct, then I will say, well, Anthony Fauci then, because he thinks that masks are 50% effective, I think that maybe I diminish his importance in this context, right? Because I have a belief, and I think that belief is more important than Anthony Fauci. If I think the inverse, that my belief that Fauci is correct is more important than my belief that masks are 100% effective, then I'll update my belief about masks in light of Anthony Fauci. Mm-hmm. And so there's this interesting contrast between the hierarchy of the beliefs we maintain and then the information we interact with.
Yeah. I was, when you started to talk about it, I was just thinking about the hierarchy of beliefs, and that should be, because I agree with you, I agree with what you say, but to look at the source of some kind of problems, let's say, we would have to look at how those beliefs are organized and what is on top there, keeping the rest of the cascade effect continue, right? So, but I know that you have a good answer for that, but like how that would be. Could you explain to me how that would be different from the thing that I always talk about? It's prestige bias, which I am critical about. But so you look at a source, and the source is seen as competent by others because others have already obtained something from that source, information or beliefs or whatever. And then, therefore, your bias, I'm quoting, I'm doing air quoting here, but your bias towards reproducing or accepting or internalizing the whatever this source is putting out, being a belief or practices or information, basically information in general. So how would you distinct? How you make a distinction between those two things? Because you know that I'm very critical to the first, so I just wanted to make a clear cut there.
I see them still as beliefs here, right? Because I see the belief that a group of people believe that a source is accurate is still a belief. Because I don't, when I look at the sources that right-wing folks use, that's a population of people. It's, say, 10 million people. Say I'm standing in the middle of those 10 million people. I still, because of what I believe, how I believe my beliefs differ from their beliefs, I won't take them as valid sources of information. So here you have, a hierarchy of beliefs thing where if I believe that I need to say I trust them because they will kill me if I don't, maybe my belief that self-preservation in this moment is more important than my belief in taking a stand. I could also believe the opposite, Bruno being burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church in the 1500s. It's an interesting sort of thing where it's still, do I believe that group of people that trust the source are effective at making judgments about the truth? And this is actually, like, the set of studies I did a few years ago was exactly on this, of the people that we share beliefs with, do we take them to be accurate sources of information just because we share beliefs with them? And it seems like the answer is yes. Like, they don't need to be any closer, epistemically, like any closer to the evidence gathering process than a journalist, but I can trust them because I share beliefs with them over the journalist who's maybe on the ground in a place.
And you could very strongly share beliefs with only one other person, while you could gather some information from a very, very prestigious source. But if your proximity on, like, your overlapping of beliefs with this only single person in the world, you would definitely prefer to gather information from this person. So, like,
that can definitely happen. Yeah, I think that the whole idea of a cult or any prophet capitalizes on this idea, right? It's just that there is a whole world of information, 8 billion people, but this one person telling me that everything there is wrong, but what they're telling me is correct, is literally the denial of the world and the acceptance of a microcosm. And that's quite interesting.
I was thinking, like, well, there is an aspect on cults that the presence of the group creates a second level of benefits.
Definitely.
But what I was thinking about was more like an abusive relationship.
Oh, like where self-preservation is evolved explicitly, physical.
Yeah. No. I mean, you let's say you have a partner, and somehow throughout the years, this person made or convince you that you share a lot of those beliefs. So, but you share. You didn't convince you. Like, you
adopted their beliefs.
Yeah, you adopted their beliefs, and there's a lot of people around you and say, look, the things that you're believing, actually they are not true. And a lot of people might agree with that person. You wouldn't change your belief, for example, that you should get out of that relationship, as long as you believe that you're sharing a lot of beliefs with this person who is with you all the time. So that's what I was thinking. But I think the cult definitely can be used as an example. I think it's different levels, but I wanted to get to the extreme point to say, yeah, there is nothing prestigious about this person that you are, this abusive person that you are in a relationship with, because nobody else believes that person but you. But because you share so many beliefs with this person, you think that's the best source of information that you can have. This person is going to tell you how to live your life, what you should do at what time and when, regardless of how resourceful or how competent are the outside sources. They're telling you that, look, that's not how you should live your life.
Yeah, I think there's a crucial element here of sort of a robustness of your identity, where if one person is the only other person you share all these beliefs with, then you don't have a very robust identity, because it's, if they go, you have no social support system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of it, if not potentially all of it, is dictated by our desire to build a persona which will survive in society.
Mm-hmm.
And so we adopt the beliefs that we feel will help us navigate that. And I don't think that we are always aware of that. I think that the things that we feel we're driven towards are the things that match that desire. So I don't need to think that being a leftist is the strategic thing. It's just that maybe I feel that being a leftist is the right thing to be, but that feeling is generated by my perception of the reality that I have and the type of person that I might want to be in that society. And I think that ends up being really important, this idea that we won't be ostracized from our groups and that we will fit into the groups that we are a part of. Mm-hmm. When you get something like it, because what we can see, which is really interesting, is that folks who are susceptible to conspiracy theories are not typically those folks that have very robust social networks. They have a lot of friends, they have a stable family, they have a stable job. It's the people who don't have those things. It's the people who are looking for a niche to build where they can get some kind of group satisfaction, this type of belonging. And so typically it's the people who are ostracized from their groups, don't have a lot of friends, don't have stable relationships, whether romantic or family, and maybe potentially also they don't even have stable careers or things like that, where their engagement with the world is not necessarily stable. And they find groups of people, and this is why the internet is such a great tool for generating conspiracy theorists, is that you don't need to be in the same place to find each other. You can find each other online, and all of a sudden you walk around the world slightly more included into a group, but that group is virtual. The internet has allowed for that, which is why we see conspiracy theories fully, promulgated in today's world in a very different scale than 100 years ago, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, I don't want it to take the focus from, because I completely agree with you. That's is the social aspect, or what we believe that the social group is, or in like a natural drive towards surviving in societies, in groups. That's on the root of a lot of our behavior, definitely the social behavior, because mostly what we're talking about, when like the transference of information from one mind to another, it is a social phenomenon. It's not you can take it as a very solipsist kind of like perspective, yes, but it's happening within the context of people living in societies. I didn't want to take the focus because I completely agree with you. What I was mentioned before, because in the beginning I said that the way that I see, and the way that it makes sense for me to think about the word, is that there is, and you definitely agree with that, there is degrees that you can look at the same thing happening. And when I mentioned in the beginning is that, well, we can look at the whole world and things that happen in the whole world scale, but we can go down to the individual. And I was just reducing to a two-person kind of phenomenon. So
For sure.
yeah, so this person can have the belief that this other only single person, it's all the social work that they can have. So that's the group that is going to maintain them alive. And that's what I meant. I believe that it takes a slight pathological turn over there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because the things that you and I push back against are building towards the same idea. They're coming from the same place. And the ideas that we're pushing against are also built on the same idea. Like, because the idea of prestige and typical ideas of group influence are built on the same concept, which is that the groups are out there in the world, that we use the groups out there in the world to decide what to accept. And I think prestige bias is sort of built on something like this, where we look to society, we look towards individuals that are labeled as prestigious, and then we follow them. But the movement that we're talking about now is shifting it towards placing it in a more cognitive sense, back into the individual, and then saying that their interpretation of their environments is what's critical, whether that's in a dyad or whether that's them interpreting society as a whole.
Exactly. Yeah. No, definitely. What's happening? Yeah, I think the thing with the prestige bias is put a focus on you receiving some kind of signal that's very well. It's very simplistically explained, and when we talked about it, we were talking about like, well, there is something that happens on the social environment, and there is something that we understand that happens in the social environment. Those things are there's something between it, and that's what we're trying to understand, and that's the precise thing that must be understood. So that's not simplest at all. That's demand us understanding how information is computed within the individual and how we make sense of it and how that affects our decisions.
Yeah. So then maybe one of the things we can move into, unless you have another topic, is also just the idea of what information is in general. Because I think that this is also an interesting sort of thing where we have, so something I think about a lot, right, is when we look at climate change, a reality that at this point is inescapable, given the evidence. We know we're going to be experiencing massive effects in the coming decades of our exploitation of the resources that we've mined from the earth. But an interesting thought experiment is when I ask other scientists whether their belief on climate change would change if a large portion of climate scientists started saying, oh, we were wrong about climate change. How invested are we? How prioritized is the belief that climate change is real versus the belief that we are scientists, therefore our fellow scientists who are climate scientists have the greatest access to information? Would we begin to doubt the institution or the institutions that support most climate scientists and say, well, clearly big oil has gotten to our fellow scientists? Or would we say, oh shit, we've been wrong this whole time? And so that's an interesting, so what's more prioritized for us at this point?
I think I answered that before.
I definitely have asked you before as well.
I think for me, the thing to be believed there, from my perspective, it's how we understand the science is produced. So we are in the environment of science, and I think we are investing our times and lives in the environment of science because we truly believe that we are playing by the same rules, right? So we are being, I'm not.
Like we as scientists are playing by the same rules as those scientists.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So we are being peer reviewed, we are being scrutinized, we're being kind of checked and balanced by other people in our field that not necessarily wanted us to like, they do not have, they might, but not necessarily want us to put us out of the game or put us in the game, and they are checking us by our ideas. So there's like blind peer reviewing, and so this idea is good enough or not good enough, or this data was well collected or not well collected, or this statistical analysis makes sense. The inference that you make from this statistical analysis makes sense. This one doesn't make sense. So I think we both, like, we are investing our time in life and that. So I think we have a belief that we are somehow playing by the same rules than the climate change scientists. Although I'm 100% sure that you also don't believe that happens 100% of the time.
Yeah, it's this interesting thing where we have built our socio-ecological niches, our identities, on the idea that science is a valid enough process to believe. So we have a bias that the institution of science, while heavily flawed, and I think you and I are two people to readily admit flaws in the industry of science, although the industry of science and the institution of science should definitely be disambiguated in people's minds. It's two fundamentally different things.
Definitely.
That we have faith in the institution of science, whereas the industry of science is the more flawed one. Is that, I mean, if climate scientists turned around and said this was a big mistake, climate change is not right, then we ought to believe them for the same reasons that we believe them in the first place. The likelihood of that happening in the real world with this example is so much beyond a likely possibility. I just want to put that out there. But yes, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment, because it does force us to think about why we accept certain information and why we adopt certain beliefs. The other thing being, I lost my train of thought. You go ahead.
No. I think there is it's complicated because we're believing that they are playing. It's not even playing by the same rules. We're believing that they are applying the same process that we do apply. So we wanted to publish a paper. We write it. We send it to someone. Someone look at it and say, hey, this idea doesn't make sense because of A, B, and C. And then you look at it and say, okay, yeah, that you're right, or maybe you're wrong, and I can prove that you're wrong. And so it is a process that we do. So it's like pushing a nail into the wall. So you have done it before, you know how that works. And if everybody else knows, like, if you believe that they are pushing nails through the wall, you know that if they do it the right way, then you will be in the wall. You know, like it's a process. So there isn't. I don't know. I think I would make the distinction about being able to. It's complicated because it's. Publishing an article is not pushing a nail into the wall, but being able to understand how a process works and you yourself going through the process and saying, okay, this process works, and I tried, and it does work, and with the constraints, and then you say, would you say, like, I believe that the process works, or does the process work because if it's processed in this way, it does. Like it's an algorithm kind of process. Like is an algorithm believable, or it's just is? So from my perspective, it's just like, yes, if the climate scientists are doing the thing right, as I understand that the thing right to be done should be like that, I am not believing them. I am just asserting that they did a process, and that's the output of the process.
Yeah, I suppose I take everything to be belief. So even if I feel a high degree of certainty, I don't believe. I have a belief that there's no such thing as true certainty, because I don't believe in an absolute truth. And so there can be points that are made which might be valid criticisms that are addendums or nuances to associate with our acceptance of a particular statement. And so in that sense, that's why I say I believe that what they are doing is true. And the belief, the use of the word belief doesn't make me less comfortable with the degree of accuracy I think that they're achieving. But the degree of accuracy is towards a self-defined procedural end, in that we've built the process, we've built the tools, we've built the concept of each variable, and we've put all of these things in place. So they're all manufactured by human beings. And they're manufactured by human beings to produce reliable outputs. But it's still the reliability of the output that we're taking as truth, not something like truth itself, which, whether it exists or not, is up for debate. Whether it's accessible or not, I think, no. We cannot harvest the absolute truth from whatever reality we exist within. And I think that to me is the main thing. That doesn't make me any less confident, I think, than you. But maybe because I spent more time on the philosophy side. Yeah. For me, it definitely.
I'm feeling it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's because it's an interesting thing, because so when we look at people outside of the sciences, it's important to remember that an individual scientist doesn't have, they might have slightly greater, or not even slightly, just greater epistemic access to their field than any of us outside of their field. Mm-hmm. But that one scientist alone doesn't constitute legitimacy of a belief. Like, one scientist isn't enough. Mm-hmm. It takes the consensus of that field to actually determine what's believable. And that's really important, because the individual scientist can have flaws. They will have flaws, and they will have biases. Mm-hmm. And the way we try to eliminate flaws and biases is by putting a bunch of scientists to the same set of problems, and then seeing what comes out, how they can find the greatest common denominator of what they collectively believe. Mm-hmm. And everything else falls on the sidelines of individual sub-segments mm-hmm. of that industry. And I think that's also really important, because sometimes a scientist comes on television or makes a post or something, and if it's outside of their domain, then, I mean, feel free to discard it entirely as their opinion. But even if it's within their domain, it has to be taken with a grain of salt of, okay, what does the field actually say about this? One neuroscientist making one claim about the brain isn't sufficient, because 90% of neuroscientists could disagree with them. And I think that there's an interesting thing where, when we move from, what we try to do with science is built-in procedural accuracy, meaning mm-hmm. limit the parameters of the errors, mm-hmm. right? Like how big the errors can be. And as we move towards greater and greater amounts of variables, basically, which happen as we move from the hard sciences like physics and chemistry over into things like biology and cognitive science, and then from there into more sociology and anthropology, where the variables get very large, mm-hmm. the variance increases with the amount of variables that we can control. Mm-hmm. And I think that there, it's also really important, because every field, like within field expert, will know how much error is acceptable mm-hmm. for certain findings. You could have a chemist would have much smaller error bars than us mm-hmm. as cognitive scientists, mm-hmm. and cognitive scientists would have much smaller error bars than an economist. And what we're doing, in some sense, is built on the same principles, mm-hmm. But they're adapted to the questions that we're asking.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. That's completely true. That we might use the same process to tackle different problems, and that create different differences on the outputs we get, on the reliability of the outputs we get. I think there's another problem as well. That, as you said, as you mentioned, the idea of having fields on which you understand very well what's going on, or having kind of like overlapping with other fields. It's just we cannot understand everything, even within our own field. So we kind of rely on other people to inform us about things that are actually relevant for us and for our process. And if along the chain something goes wrong, because what I was thinking is just like something that is good about it, that nobody, no scientist wants to create or to produce work that is flawed. But that's insane to believe, right? So what you do, you try to get around the most accurate and the best ideas around you, because you don't want to produce flawed work. So scientists start to look, what start to be selected within a broad range of fields is those ideas that survive the cry of inspection of many different people who are looking for the best ideas among those ideas out there. So that's the good part. So the ideas that survive the cry of many scientists looking for the best are those ideas that became more widespread. At the same time, if one bad idea managed to survive the cry and it passed along, it can also become widespread when it's not checked. And we see that happen in science. Not once. Not only once, but a couple times.
Yes, for sure. I mean, we need to understand that any theory of science that we have is a description built on trying to describe a set of patterns that we see of a defined set of variables that we've generated. Mm-hmm. So that view in science, or the philosophy of science, is something called pessimistic meta-inductivism, which is the idea that theories are constructed and that they will be improved over time necessarily, that nothing is perfect as is. It's also, you could also look at things that are very similar, like constructivism or instrumentalism. Instrumentalist views of science basically see scientific theories as tools for better predicting reality, but not as definitions of reality itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really important, because when we look at science, the output of science is arguably the most accurate bits of information that we can have about the topics it speaks about. But that isn't necessarily the truth. Like I was saying, like we were talking about before, which is that looking at it as the truth is flawed. And so looking at it as this is a really good, reliable estimate, and it will be improved in ways that I can't foresee in the future. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that part's really important.
No, I get it.
And one other thing to kind of build on what you were getting at as well is I was thinking about an analogy of a house where everybody in a particular field, so in my field, I know it as well as I would know, say, my house. But within my house, there are a bunch of things that even if I know how they operate better than other people might know their actual construction and how they work better than I do. So I have a refrigerator, and I know how my refrigerator works. I know the inside, I know the appearance, I know what's inside of it. But I don't know how to build a refrigerator, and I don't know how to fix the refrigerator. But it's my refrigerator in my apartment. So That's true of many things in my apartment. You know, I can change the light bulb. I know which light switch turns that light bulb on, but I didn't do the wiring myself, and I actually don't know how to do wiring. So this is true also of fields in science where you know your house, you know the things in your house, you know how those things work, you know how to fiddle with them if they're not quite right. But if they're broken or if you have to make them from scratch, you need somebody in another field to help you with that, because we're all taking conceptual and instrumental loans from other fields to actually build our science. And I think that that's the really beautiful thing about it, is that maybe some biologists build microscopes, but probably they don't. And the engineers have built it. And you have a whole set of scientists involved with the engineers to help build a better microscope itself. And so these are really interesting facets where when we look at a scientist, no field is done in a vacuum, except maybe something like maths or pure philosophy or something like that.
No, for sure. I get that. I had some thoughts when we were speaking, but yeah, you. Yeah, I got entangled on the ending of your conversation, and then I lost what I had. But yeah, you're talking about the point that we do not have the cognitive resource to understand every single thing that we have to use to make us better scientists.
That we rely on one another.
Yeah, we rely on other. Yeah, we have to. There is no other way to do it, and yeah, I think I get your point about, and I think I can definitely put together what I said before about the climate change. Scientists, if they would give me the output of their research saying there is no climate change, I still believe, in these cases, believe, as you mentioned, the output to be true. What I said before is just like, I trust the process. I do not believe the process. I trust that if you follow the algorithm, that's going to be the output. I think the output, I have to believe on it, because a lot of things could have not gone exactly as predicted, or the scientists maybe do not understand the tools that they were using, or so on and so forth. But yeah, I agree with you. Like it is a belief on the output of that thing.
Yeah. I would also say it's a belief in the instrument itselove, in the process itself.
Yeah, okay, it's fine. I can take
I'm not like pushing back. I'm just putting it out there, because I think it's an interesting sort of thing where the information we accumulate, the ways we interact with our realities, things are malleable, even when we think that they are not. And then again, it's not like.
But do you think mathematics, like, are beliefs? So the mathematical output of an equation is a belief?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I've gone. It's one of the things that's an interesting sort of discussion when it comes down to when you're having conversations with people about objectivity, whether you can move from epistemics to something like a metaphysics, like do numbers actually exist? I think that, to me,
numbers are quantities or whatever.
Yeah, well,
doesn't matter.
And there's slightly different things, I suppose, right? Because you've quantities of things, and then the world of maths, which, yeah, and it's an interesting thing, because what maths tries to do is, well, what it initially tried to do is provide a way to quantify our realities, and then what it revealed was a whole set of concepts that exist way beyond what we can experience and quantify. And I think that's quite interesting, and that pure maths is a very interesting philosophy of symbol manipulation, and that we all contain our versions of that thing, of that process. And similar to, I don't necessarily think that the language exists out in the world. There are physical representations of what we use to communicate, but I think everybody has their own conception of what the language is. In that, I don't know if we can describe with words exactly what we think about every word and how it's interconnected. We have our own internal maps of meaning that we use, and I think this is also true of numbers. And I think this is also true of maths. It's not that I don't need to believe or not believe that 1 and 1 plus 1 equals 2. I can accept that as a procedural output. I don't need to believe that it's right or wrong. I can just accept that this is the process, this is the output.
Yeah.
My acceptance of what 2 is, or what I believe 2-ness is, I think that's where the belief comes in.
But that was exactly my point. That I trust the process. It's just because there is a level of complexity between the two things that we are comparing. Because what I was talking about of the scientific process being an algorithmic process, just like to reduce it. Obviously, it's much more complex than that. But I'm saying, like, look, if you have thermometers in the Arctic and you measure every once a day for this amount of time, and then you plug in equations and so on, and then you get an output of that. Out of that, the process is trustful. I mean, it's not a mathematical. It's not in the same sense a mathematical process, but that's what I meant. That, like, okay, that's the process that should give an output that can be interpreted like that. The interpretation of it is a belief. The process is trustful.
You're saying that you believe that the process exists versus you believe that the process is accurate. And I think these are two different things. Like, if I believe that the process exists, I think that's... You'd have to have that belief,
I
right?
believe the process is accurate to give me something.
Yes, which is what I'm saying is a belief.
Yes,
because
exactly.
you can have somebody who believes the opposite. And I think that that's also...
That the process does not give you something.
Of course. And you can also have somebody that believes the process is slightly different from what you believe the process is. And you can also have people who will argue that science is not necessarily just the process itself. And I think that that's why I would stick with something like it is a belief. It's that 1 plus 1 equal 2 is one of the most widely shared beliefs on the planet. But as you get to more abstract or complex mathematics, you won't have explicit beliefs about those things. And I could write an equation for you and give an output that's incorrect. And I would say, do you believe this? Whether you believe it or not, is it consequential? There's an algorithmic process. Some people will believe they know how to solve it. Some people will believe they know how to solve it and be incorrect.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think I still think it's important to look at these things as beliefs and nothing in absolutes. Because even you or I could attempt to describe the scientific process and we could have different descriptions of it. We could use the phrase, the process of science, and state that we believe that it's accurate. But when we try to define the scientific process, I don't think we could say that it just is out in the world. And therefore, I don't require a belief to define it.
Yeah, I think, you're completely right. I would describe as observing, isolating a hypothesis, gathering data, using or like making an experiment. But I jumped into the gather the data and then test your hypothesis. That's what I meant. But like, it's very blunt. It's very there's many things in between. You can describe it in different ways.
Yeah, that's because it's interesting because it's an interesting place you started, because I would start at variable definition, and maybe this is just because I go from outside in terms of or how I think about it mentally is from theory to hypothesis, whereas I know a lot of scientists also work solely with hypotheses or work with hypotheses and then models. and they go models, hypotheses, models.
Yeah.
For me, it's the theory side in, and the theory side is built for me on an analytic philosophy grounding. So it's always definitions first, and then once we've defined the variables, then we can begin the process.
Most of my training is ethology.
Yeah.
So I work with observation.
Yes.
So I look at nature and I look for patterns, and then from those patterns I create hypotheses. So there's definitely differences even in how we would see the process. That's completely true.
Yeah, I think it's really fun. It's fun because probably, and maybe this isn't the best time to go into this, but there is an important distinction between hypotheses, models, and theories. And these are things that maybe we could chat about at a different time. But when you look at a hypothesis, it's a directly falsifiable claim about rigidly defined variables. And then when you have enough hypotheses, you can build a model from which to extract further hypotheses. The model is about the interactions of variables themselves. And then the theory is the broadest of the three, where you can posit sets of models, their interactions, and then the significance of those things. And so you go from the micro scale hypotheses to sort of this medium level model to large scale theory. And one of the problems and criticisms of certain fields is that they don't have, you can sort of criticize fields at any point in this process, some where they don't have rigid enough hypotheses, but they do have models and theories, and some where they have models and hypotheses, but they don't actually have theories, or that they skip the model point and then go straight from hypothesis to theory. And so these gaps are funny too.
I think I really jumped the gun when I said the process of science. We could have another episode just talking about what that is. Yes, definitely. That's very rich.
Yeah, and maybe something shifting a bit towards the evidence gathering itself is something that's quite interesting is that humans, so in the natural philosophy realm, like 500 years ago, what we would use are our senses. And we then developed a form of observation, and the observation still relied on our senses. And I think one really interesting thing that happened, I think beginning with the telescope, which was created by, if I remember correctly, a Dutch optician who wanted to create better glasses for one of his clients, ended up realizing that refraction of lenses at different distances created a telescopic effect, and they started creating telescopes. And so that was the first tool used for observation, scientific observation, that extended the capacity of our senses. And that is a huge conceptual shift in what human beings do, which is super cool, because now we not only rely on our senses, but what we do is we rely on our senses through tools that magnify our senses or take wide ranges of information across different modalities and spectrums and condense them to the senses that we can use, usually sight and sound, to analyze things. Whether it's a microscope or telescope, or a spectrometer, or anything like the condensing of sound into this microphone. It's a lot of really amazing things that human beings have done to extend our capacity and the bandwidth of information that our senses can perceive.
No, definitely. Yeah, with the advent of computers, we have simulations.
Yeah,
which completely changed the game of observing nature in a very, very, very complex way.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, about simulations.
Yeah. Just
no.
Like, what does it do for science?
Yeah, no, I do not have so much to talk about simulations. I have been interested on agent-based modeling, and I think that there's a really nice place to understand a part of social phenomena through this kind of simulation. And I had some lectures, and I talked to some really nice people, really knowledgeable people in the field, and I have heard many things that I think I could definitely spend some time talking about in an episode about talking about the process of science, because it touches on some things that you already mentioned about modeling, about about fields or ways to think about science, and where there are models generate hypotheses, which generate new models that come back with new hypotheses. And I think that's a fun field to be looking at. I think it's also nice for us to be open to the broad spectrum of understanding nature. So I will be happy to go a little bit further on understanding how to use simulations to understand social phenomena in the future. So I will be working on that. I will try my best to work on that direction. But it's just a part of the rich way that we can make sense of what's going on in reality.
Yeah, and just to add a few more words to that, because I think the process is super interesting. Just so it's not left opaque, is that when we're modeling something, what we're doing is deciding upon a set of variables and then parameters or values that those variables might take, and then run interactions between the variables.
Yeah, and there's many different properties, right, that you can do with modeling. So you can reduce the complexity of the word to very specific variables, or you can have you can know exactly the variables that you wanted to model, and play with them. Just like take this variable out, take this one out, put a new one. Maybe find out that there is one variable that you do not know that is influencing there, and you can discover with modeling. So you can scale up, you can scale down, you can increase complexity, you can decrease complexity, you can play with time. You can just things that would take, like interactions that would take a long time to observe in nature, you can speed it up. You can just create a time frame on where you see those interactions playing many times in a short period of time. Or you can also something that just escapes. So you can play with time. You can play with scale. So if you can have a phenomenon that is really hard to observe in nature because of the amount of agents, or amount of molecules, or amount of cells that on which this phenomenon occurs, and you cannot observe them all at the same time. If you have a model, you can increase it to the size that you wanted them to be, if you have enough computer power. So you can do all of those things, and all of those things are part of the process, or they're all tools in the process of understanding the phenomena that you are interested on. And I think that's fascinating. That's really interesting, and I think it's very useful for social phenomena. They're using for many different things. You can use to understand the behavior of stars, or particles, or chemicals, or cells, molecules, or people, or so on. There is also there are constraints, but I think they're very well acknowledged within the field, and they're not they do not both the constraints are acknowledged, and they work well with the power of the tools that they have.
Yeah, I think one of the important things is the removal or the selection of variables, because you can't account for everything. And different fields, sometimes the definition between different fields is literally, sometimes they're trying to answer the same question, but the difference is the amount of variables they try to account for. Mm-hmm. When you have something like cognitive psychology versus cognitive sociology, cognitive anthropology, sometimes the question is very similar, but the one is trying to reduce the variables as much as possible, mm-hmm. and the other one is trying to include as many variables as possible. Mm-hmm. And so you get this really interesting thing where it's great that we're having both being done, mm-hmm. because they give us two different types of answers. Because because when we do statistical analysis, what we do is we actually test the impact of variables themselves. We can also do analyses to test how much the variables are actually impacting the variables that we're measuring. And I think that the really interesting thing is that we can say something like, okay, these three variables make up 95% of the variance in my variable that I'm measuring, which would be a hugely strong effect. You usually don't get that in cognitive psychology. But when we do things like this, when we reduce it, we can still, there are certain questions where we can simplify the question enough and the variable that we're measuring enough where we can account for a large amount of variance just with a small set of variables. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to put that as an amendment to anybody who's listening to you describe modeling in this really wonderful way.
Yeah.
And not...
I think just to mention that, I was referring to what I have learned on computational modeling. So it's
exactly, yeah.
But I believe that the mathematical modeling would go in the same direction. You could do absolutely the same things.
Yeah, and when we say simplify the problem, sometimes obviously we are losing something. There's always a sacrifice to be made, but that there are ways to demonstrate that the question that we are asking doesn't lose too much, or the answer that we provide doesn't lose too much by the simplification of the variables involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. We drifted a little bit away from the information or navigating the range of, I don't know how to call it, the ocean of information that we are drowning every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we probably covered a good amount.
Yeah, we did. I wanted to reflect. I think I had this idea to reflect a little bit too, because a lot of people there might feel very anxious with a lot of things that they see on the media every day. And I wanted to just like to send this message that heads up and just keep critical and try to be patient with the process of understanding what's going on. I think everybody's on the same board. It's super stressful and it makes you anxious. We're dealing with media and information all days. And it's because some of the things that we mentioned now in the last hour, the implications that information brings within our cognitive well-being, some things related to the way that our species are socially socially dependent, or our drive to depend on each other to survive, and most of the phenomena that we see out there on the availability of information might be strongly related to personal interests, or like interests of institutions, interests of this personas that we, or these things that we talked about. But you can add something on that direction. I think I just wanted to close in the note of bringing back to what we proposed to be talking a little bit about. But
yeah, no, I think that's a great note to end on. Is that a lot of people are in the same boat, and that we can take steps to be better informed, but then also have to take steps to understand our place, and also understand what it takes for us to be better agents. And sometimes that's rest, and sometimes it's sort of refreshing ourselves emotionally and cognitively to make sure that we can do the types of work that maybe make us feel slightly less powerless in global affairs. Mm-hmm. Right on.
That's great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.